Welcome to Crosswords, the podcast about practical Christianity. What does it look like to walk in Jesus' footsteps? How do I live in a culture hostile to godliness? These are questions that we'll answer on each podcast as we get our heart and mind on Jesus. All scriptures quoted are from the New International Version. You can follow me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing. Today I want to talk to you about wisdom. We've been on this trend lately of wisdom, and Charlie kind of preached half of the sermon I was going to give to you today last week. But it's good. The Holy Spirit has us on a trend here for wisdom, and we've been using Moses' prayer as the starting point or the launching point for that. This is the second half of a prayer that I've been sharing with you for the past 3 lessons. This is Moses saying, "Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow." We've been on that theme lately, as Danny even spoke about that today in the Lord's Supper lesson. Trouble and sorrow, they quickly pass and we fly away. And Moses cries out to God, "If only we knew the power of your anger." So we have a necessity to know God's wrath, but we don't want to know it intimately. We know God is angry. He is upset that people don't believe in him, have rejected his message, even have crucified his son and don't reject him, continuing to this day. But thankfully there is a way out. He says, "Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due." So there is a necessity for us human beings to learn to fear God. And that's why he says in verse 12, "Teach us to number our days." Teach us to use our days, basically, in the best way possible, to take advantage of the life that we have, not to waste our time, waste our resources, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Wisdom is needed to understand the wrath of God and how we can not have the wrath of God come on us, but avoid it altogether, and to help us understand how to fear God so that we can use our life in a way that pleases God. So we've discussed a few strategies to do that, have we not? We talked about being a planter and a waterer, a gospeler, basically, in order to keep us focused on our task at hand. We also understand that when we do that there is suffering that we need to endure, as Danny was saying. Jesus suffered. He opened a road. The road to follow in his footsteps, as Peter says, is to conform to the sufferings of Christ. So suffering can become our friend. And Peter says that if we suffer being conscious of God, we can use suffering as a tool to lead us to increase in our fear of the Lord and therefore wisdom, to be on this kind of a path. Suffering can help us gain a godly fear that can lead to peace and that can lead to wisdom. As Charlie pointed out in last week's lesson, James makes it easy. He tells us the secret to obtain wisdom here. He says, if you lack it, hey, ask God. He's generous, and he'll just give it to you. Isn't that great? I wish that could work with money, right? If I don't have money, I just ask God, and he's generous, and he just gives it to me. It's great to have that, right? But no, it doesn't work that way with money, but it works that way with something even more important than money, because I would say wisdom is more important than money. Doesn't Solomon in the Proverbs tell us to seek wisdom more than precious jewels, more than gold? Solomon, the wisest man on earth, said that wisdom, he said, obtain it at any cost. But we're not talking here about the wisdom of man. We're not talking about the wisdom that you can go and find in a university or in other books. No, that wisdom is not going to really help you much. It might help you here on earth, but even not so. A lot of that wisdom actually keeps you apart from God. As many scientists, as we saw in the 7 Reasons to Believe in God, some scientists think that they know so much that they don't need to know about God. So I would say that kind of wisdom distracts you from God at best. And it may give you something here, but the wisdom that we all really need is the wisdom that is going to teach us to fear the Lord. And that wisdom is very practical even for living our life here, as we will see today. So James says, ask God, but he gives us a condition. God is not to be approached like a genie in a bottle. Give me my 3 wishes. No. If you want to approach God and you want to ask him, your heart needs to be right. You need to ask, as he says here in verse 6, but you must believe and not doubt. In other words, you can't be someone whose doubts make you like the wave of a sea, blown and tossed back and forth, wavering between 2 opinions. That's not how we approach God. We have to approach God knowing he's there, believing he exists, and knowing that he richly rewards us, as the Hebrew author puts it, even though we don't deserve it. So we have to be approaching God humble and decisive to follow him and lean on him upon receiving that wisdom that he wants to give us. If not, then verse 7 says, don't expect to receive anything from God, because you're a hypocrite. You're double-minded. You're unstable. Sometimes we need to assess if we're being that in our lives. We want to live in the world sometimes. This is, what puts us in that condition is that we want to have 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in the kingdom. And in that position, being tossed back and forth, being of 2 wavering opinions, we're not going to receive anything from God. We need to be fully committed to the way of God and fully believing in order to receive the wisdom that he so much wants to give us. That's the encouraging part. He wants to give it to us, but we really need to align ourselves with this. He gives it for free. All you got to do is ask. Do you lack wisdom? I know I do. Constantly. So I have to ask God. I can't be a hypocrite. Now, it's interesting that Jesus compares wisdom in the parable. He talks about the wise and the foolish builders. He gives us some interesting things to consider in our quest for wisdom. So I want to examine this parable. We're not going to read it. You can read it at home, and most of you know it already. But what does this parable say about wisdom and about folly? The wise and the foolish builders. It starts out by Jesus saying, the wise man built his house on the rock. The foolish one built his house on the sand. So we can say that everyone wants to build a house. We all want to build a house. And what is the house in this parable? The house is our life. The house is what we want to do with our lives, this very life that God has given us. Everybody wants to do something with it. So everybody has dreams. Everybody has aspirations. Everybody has plans. Everybody hopes that their plans and aspirations is going to lead them to have a good life. Who hopes in living a way that is going to harm them? Who hopes in living in a way that is bad? I don't think anybody does. But yet, some people's houses turn out to be quite bad, and they even crash, as Jesus says. Why is that? Well, in this parable, Jesus teaches us that there are only 2 kinds of grounds that we can build on, just 2. So that unclutters our choices here, right? Only 2, either the rock or the sand. Jesus says, if you hear his words and you put them into practice, that's the tricky part. A lot of people hear the words of Jesus. Many of you here can hear the words of Jesus. You read the Bible, you hear the Bible on tape, you're hearing his words. That's not the hard part. That's quite passive. But in order to put them into practice, we need to pay attention to the words. We need to discern those words. We want to understand those words. Here's where the wisdom comes into place. I want to understand what Jesus is saying, which means I need to believe in what Jesus is saying so that I can put it into practice. If you go to the doctor because you have a condition and the doctor gives you a medication for you to take, if you don't take the medication, then why are you going to the doctor? Why? You're not putting it into practice. And that's how many people say that they're Christians. They go to a church, they read their Bible, but their lives are no different than anybody else's. Their houses look just like all the other houses out there built on the sand because they don't put Jesus' words into practice. And brothers and sisters, visitors, there are no other options. There's either putting his words into practice or not putting his words into practice. And that's the difference between building on the rock and on the sand. Because you know what? Here's what's going to happen to everybody. Rain is going to fall on every single person out there. Some of us like rain, on a nice hot day, little nice warm rain, I like to bike in it a little bit, as long as it's not that much, right? Just, a little mist there to cool me off. But when the rain is prolonged, when it's heavy, when it's bad, that kind of rain that causes landslides or flooding, that's not something we desire. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. And you know what? Some of our houses can deal with rain, right? As long as we don't have a hole in our roof or windows that are broken. When it rains really hard, I check the siding of my house, make sure all the gutters are working great. I want to spot a problem before it becomes too bad, just so that I don't want the water in my house. As long as it's outside, that's okay. But rain is going to come to everybody. God is gentle, and he will bring some rains into your life before he brings the floods and the hurricanes. And that rain is kind of like saying, are you ready? Are you getting prepared? Are you learning to put my words into practice? So that rain, we can't ignore it when it comes into our life. It's an opportunity to really assess if our house is being built on the rock. Because what happens is that streams also rise on everyone. The rains and the streams happen to both of those who are building on the rock and on the sand. And you know what? The houses may tolerate it. The question is the ground that it's built on going to tolerate it? That's what we're talking about here. Sometimes the rain is so hard that streams rise into your life. And just like you would never want to see that picture with your house on it, you don't want to see what a life looks like without God and the water is up to here in issues, in problems. The rain. What is the rain? What am I saying when I talk about rain? Well, rain are those problems like Danny was mentioning. Maybe there are little issues you have to deal with standing in line at the DMV. I consider that a rainy day. Have to go renew the passport. Okay, there goes 3 hours of my day. Little rain happens here and there, but we don't, stuff we got to do, right? We tolerate that. But what about when the streams rise? Oh, we don't like that. That's serious issues. Wouldn't you say if the water is up to here and your house is like that, that's a serious issue? Oh, what do we do then? That's tough. What do we do when the streams are coming through your door and through your window? What are you practicing in the midst of these issues? Who are you turning to when you are experiencing this? Because if you don't get a clue by this time, then what's coming next is pretty bad. It's going to be destructive. If your life is not built on the rock, if your house is not on the rock, the kinds of winds that are going to beat against that house, in combination with the rain and the flood waters, that's tough. I like a nice breeze in the summer too. I appreciate it. I don't like a breeze in the winter. I don't like hurricanes. I don't like tornadoes. They are destructive. There's nothing nice about them. And these will beat against your house along with the rain and the wind. We're talking about a full-on storm here in your life. And Jesus says this is going to happen to both those who built their house on the rock and also those who built their house on the sand. Just because you're building your house on the rock doesn't mean you're not going to be tested in this way. It will happen. The question is, can you handle it? Can your house handle it? Can the ground that you're building on handle it? When we're talking about ground here, we're talking about your spiritual foundations. If the foundations of my life are based on Jesus Christ, on putting his words into practice, I am building on the rock. If every decision that I make for my life, for my family, for where I'm going to work, what am I going to do, how I'm going to approach this, is based on every word that Jesus has taught me and on me practicing it. I am building on the rock. I'll be able to handle anything this world throws at me. Anything. That's what Jesus says. Because my house will stand after all of this. But if I'm the kind of person who wants to build a nice house, just like everyone else has on the block, and I want to build it in front of the beach, because that's where it's nice. That's where it's cool. Some of you, what do you think about those who build their house right there on the water? Not considering the next Sandy or the next hurricane. And yet, after those houses get destroyed, what happens? People go out there and build again. Apparently, they're not paying attention, is what I think, right? Tornado Alley? You want to buy houses on Tornado Alley? Be my guest. Maybe that's why the land is so cheap down there, right? Or how about houses on earthquake faults? Who wants to build a home there? Some people do. And some people build homes right on the rim of those places that get those wildfires. Every year the wildfires come. And yet every year it seems people are still going there. That's people. We're people. We need wisdom. We need to learn to build on the rock. We all face all these challenges. Storms are going to come in. Everybody has to do damage control after the storms. The guy who built on the rock, he also had to do damage control on his house, but his house was still standing. The guy who built on the sand, his house fell, as Jesus says, with a great crash. There was no damage control there. We just got to start all over. And this time, hopefully, build on the rock. Why does this happen? All the houses that we've seen so far in these pictures that I've showed you, they're all like the houses that you've seen, right? You drive down the neighborhood, maybe in your neighborhood, all the houses kind of look the same. Maybe some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, some are nice to look at, some of them are like, okay, no. If you like this podcast, please show your support by clicking on the support link on my Anchor FM profile. You will find the link listed in the description of the podcast on your favorite podcast app. With your support, I will continue to produce authentic Christian content as the Lord allows me to do. Why do people want to build on the sand? I think they want to do whatever everybody else is doing. Hey, look at what that guy's doing. Let's do that. Hey, that sounds good. Let's do that. And so we're copying and trying to have or want to have what everybody else has. And when we're in that mentality, we won't know how to put Jesus' words into practice. If I want my life to be molded after or to look like some other life that is attracted to me, some other way that is attractive to me, I won't be able to put Jesus' words into practice. Isn't that what happened to Israel? When they wanted to be just like all the other nations. We want to have a king like everyone else has. We want to have a king and a castle and an army like everybody else has. And that's when the problems began. Because they wanted to be like everybody else. And so we want to build a house, a nice house, of course, a comfortable house, like everybody else, in the same way everybody else. And when that happens, we wonder why sometimes crash. You see, if we're putting our words into practice, I'm going to suggest to you that our house is going to look a little different, okay? Our life is going to look a little different. It's not going to be the same life. It's not going to be the same house that everybody else has. But it's going to be a life. It's going to be a house better prepared, don't you think, to handle the rains, the rising streams, and the winds. But if we're not paying attention to Jesus' words, we might miss that. Because we're going to be looking at what? At what everybody else is doing. When you plan, when you aspire, when you dream, is it based on the words of Jesus? Or is it based on some other life, some other thing that you want, some other aspirations that you're going after? It's really important. This parable is a short parable, the parable of the wise and foolish builders. But the implications are extremely profound when we think about it this way, don't we? Where am I building my house? What kind of a house is it? Am I building it in wisdom? Because Jesus said, after all, the wise builder is going to build on the rock. He's going to put my words into practice. But the foolish builder won't put my words into practice. Wisdom, building our lives the right way, learning through suffering to fear God, to have the peace of God, is going to lead us to a better existence, to eventually a home that you're not going to have to worry whether to build it on the sand or on the rock, because it's God's city without foundations that are going to stand for sure through all eternity. Thank God, no more bills, no more home ownership issues. You know, God's going to be in control. Or the same sufferings, right? The same wind, the same rain, the same floods, but not practicing Jesus' words will lead you to fear, will lead you to anger, to bitterness, discontent, which is going to lead you to hell. Which one do you want to do? Those are the two grounds. Build on the rock or build on the sand. James says something to say about this. He says, you think you're a wise guy? Which one are you, a wise guy or a wise man? Who is wise and understanding among you? Okay, well, here's the test. You want to know if you're wise? Let them show it. Yes, here's the chance to flaunt your wisdom. James says, show it. Don't talk about it. Show it. How? How does a wise person show that they're wise? Good life. Deeds done in humility. That comes from wisdom. See, wisdom is humble, as you will see from here. Wisdom does not boast. Wisdom is not proud. It's not arrogant. Wisdom is always shown in humility. The opposite of it is in verse 14. If you harbor bitter envy, if we get envious of what we don't have, of what somebody else has, and how come I don't have it? How come he gets to have that and I don't? How come he gets paid more than I do? How come people like him more than me? You entertain those kinds of things. There's bitter envy. There's selfish ambition. A lot of the things people do mostly is motivated by selfish ambition because of envy. Because they want people to like them. And they want to drive, the Mazda Miata or the Lexus. No offense to those of you who have those cars. People who have bitter envy, who have selfish ambition, they want those kind of jobs so that people look at them and like them. What is motivating you? James says here in verse 15, such wisdom. That's not the one that's from heaven. That's not the one that Jesus says you need to put to practice. That's the one you want to avoid. Anything that begins with envy or selfishness, that's not going to bring you wisdom. That means you're building your house on the sand. He says that wisdom is earthly, it's unspiritual, and it's demonic. 3 characteristics of earthly wisdom. It's earthly, it's of the earth. That's what everybody else is doing. Do you want to do what everybody else is doing? I don't. I now have to take a step back. If everybody else is thinking something or doing it, for sure, that's a warning sign. I want to say, I don't think so. I got to examine it a little better. It's unspiritual. It doesn't come from the words of Christ. It has no bearing on the goal that we want to have it, which is heaven. And not only that, he says here, it's demonic. And I really believe that a lot of this unspiritual wisdom, this demonic wisdom, is what a lot of demons whisper in the ears of people here on earth. That seems wise, that seems good, but it completely takes you away from God. James continues to say, where you have envy and selfish ambition, then you're going to find disorder. You ever been to a place and you're like, whoa, disorder. That's the first sign that there's envy and selfish ambition happening there. And every evil practice on top of that, he says, it's just going to be chaotic. The end result of practicing earthly wisdom is total chaos and more evil on top of it. But now he contrasts that with the wisdom that comes from heaven. It's a pure wisdom. It's not a wisdom that is of self-interest, but it's a pure wisdom. That kind of a wisdom wants or helps me desire to be pure and to avoid immorality, sexual immorality, pornography, or any of that kind of stuff. The wisdom that comes from heaven helps me want to avoid that. Do you think God is going to give you his kind of wisdom if you indulge in impure things? You really think so? That's a double-minded person. Because God's wisdom is first of all, he says, pure. That's where it has to begin. You're going to need to want to purify your life from all ungodly and immoral things. If you don't, fat chance you're going to get wisdom. From God, that is. It is pure. Then all these things stem from that. Peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy. This all stems from the purity of the wisdom of God, which in verse 18 is characterized as a peacemaker. You are wise. You have wisdom. That's from heaven. You will be a peacemaker. Ultimately, that's who you will be. As Jesus is called the Prince of Peace. And he is the peacemaker who came for us and made peace between us and God. That is the characteristic of the wisdom from heaven. So we see these characteristics. Pull them up together. We can make a summary here. What are the characteristics of spiritual wisdom? Or you could say spiritual maturity. Well, before in this verse we saw a good life, deeds done in humility, kindness and charity, which are, by the way, the opposite of bitter envy. And the opposite of selfish ambition would be generous humility. So we can summarize, that's the characteristic of spiritual maturity or of the wise person. But if you don't have wisdom, the worst thing you can do about it is to boast about it, because that's going to make you look even more foolish. Or he says, don't deny the truth. That's worse. To say, oh, no, I'm wise. If you have to say that, then you probably aren't. Because the real wise person doesn't have to say those things. They demonstrate it, as James said here. So the earthly wisdom, we could say, is boastful, envious, selfish. It denies the truth, and it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And the end of it is disorder and chaos. Sounds a lot like what you read about in the papers. Sounds like what you often see out there in the world. But real wisdom is a peacemaking experience. That comes, as we've emphasized here, and as Danny also emphasized in his lesson, by understanding, by accepting the suffering that we go through. That's what's going to mature us. But it's a suffering that is conscious of God. Because this is what suffering, not being conscious of God, produces. A suffering that is motivated by envy. Turns into fear. Oh, they don't like, oh, I'm going to get fired. Oh, this is going to happen. You get full of fear. And when you do things out of fear, that's going to lead to anger. That leads to bitterness, disappointment, will eventually lead to a mindset of being discontent. And you could be here, right here in church. You could be reading your Bible. You could be praying, and yet, this is where you're at. Why? Are you putting Jesus' words into practice? That's what it comes down to. Which, of course, means, are you believing his words? It all comes back to faith, really. Or the opposite. I am conscious of God. I'm aware of God. Even when I sin, even when I make a mistake, when I trip up, I'm conscious of God. And I beg God for forgiveness. I apologize. I'm striving for humility and openness and transparency in my relationships. That's suffering, being conscious of God. I have nothing to hide. If you said, no, you did this, and I don't remember that I did it, I'm not going to say, I didn't do any such thing. You're making it up. I'll be like, you know what? I probably did. Can you forgive me? Because I can't remember. I know I'm wicked, so I probably did something. If you said I offended you, I apologize. How can I make it better? Wisdom that comes from above. That creates a fear of God that leads to peace and that leads to more wisdom. And so that is exactly what Jesus did for us. Jesus is the peacemaker, the ultimate peacemaker, the Prince of Peace, who, despite the wicked situation that we found ourselves in, the utter chaos that is the world without Christ, because Jesus loves us so much and because he was motivated by his love for his Father and for us, he nevertheless took on that burden and willingly suffered, being conscious of God, to give us an avenue so that we could also follow him in these footsteps of wisdom, or as Peter calls them, the footsteps of suffering. That's what all Christians are called to. And this is what we call the good news, the gospel of Jesus, according to 1 Corinthians. Here we see the cross where Jesus died to provide atonement for our sin, because it was something that we were not able to do for ourselves. No matter how good someone thinks they are not able, with any good deed, to pay for even one moment of sin that they did between them and God. We cannot even pay for our own sins, which is why we're in the quandary we're in. But Jesus willingly took upon that because God required a pure sacrifice. And that is Jesus, the guiltless Lamb of God, whom we sang about not too long ago. He died, he sacrificed, gave his life for us. And so when he was raised up from the dead, as Romans 4:25 says, he raised us to justify us before God. That means to make us right before God. That we didn't deserve such a thing. We didn't do anything to make ourselves right. Yet Jesus did that. That's what he accomplished 2,000 plus years ago when he came. That was his goal. To overturn sin and death. To take away the problem of sin and to take away the problem of death that we faced. And so now we have that avenue to rid ourselves of the two biggest problems of mankind. How do we do that? Well, in order to accept that gospel, we need to be joined to Christ. And the scriptures teach us in Romans 6:3-4 that we join him when we're ready to surrender our lives to him. When we realize, yes, I don't have wisdom. I need it. Yes, I'm a sinner. I am wicked. But God accepts me anyway. Wow, I want to follow God. I want to know him. And they surrender themselves in baptism to join themselves to Christ. This is now about giving the control to God and then living a life of self-control. As Romans 6:4 says, in newness of life, just as Christ was raised from the dead. And so we recreate this gospel when we're baptized. We die to self as Jesus died on the cross. We join him in the watery grave of baptism as Jesus died and was buried. And just as he was raised, we too are raised to newness of life. So this is the way to begin this journey of building your house on the rock. Many of you here have started on this new homeowners project that Jesus teaches you to have and to do. But many of you here have not taken that first step yet. And you're building on the sand. What are you going to do? Well, if these words have touched your heart and if they've made you think, I'm going to ask you to come forward. Pray with one of these men up here. There's something in your life that's maybe preventing you from taking that step. Maybe there is some fear. Maybe there is some doubt. Well, we're here to help you out because we're all humans and we've all been through the fears and doubt that it takes to come to Christ and acknowledge and give it up. For those of you who have already started on this path, maybe with today's message, and as we looked at the parable of the wise and foolish builders, maybe you've seen something in your life that, well, maybe I am tossed about. Maybe I am wavering. Maybe I am doubting. I don't want to do that anymore. So you have an opportunity today to come forward and confess that and pray. Come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation. God bless you.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope the Lord gave you insight into conforming to Jesus with today's message. I always appreciate feedback. You can send me your thoughts, musings, and comments directly through the Anchor app. You can also contact me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing.